You're watching HFO-TV, your partner in Pacific Northwest multifamily investing. HFO-TV is brought to you by Pacific Exteriors Northwest, apartment siding contractors with nearly 30 years of experience, providing exceptional quality and service to multifamily and residential owners. And by Gantry Incorporated, the nation's largest independent mortgage banking firm.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we have with us David Garcia. He's Policy Director for Up for Growth. We've had various people from Up for Growth speak before. So David, thanks, and welcome to HFO-TV. Maybe give a background for our listeners that don't know what is Up for Growth, and then we'll get into some of the reports that just came out.
Sure. So Up for Growth is a national housing advocacy and policy organization. We focus mostly on housing policy and legislation at the federal level. Although we will at times engage with states or local governments who are looking to do pro-housing reforms.
So again, focusing more on the federal, looking at we've talked before about some states you'll kind of go into if it's, kind of set policy or show examples.
Yeah, so we also will look across states and just see what the trends are in terms of where policy is going, what states are doing things that are really interesting or innovative, and really trying to see where that lands across the country. And then seeing how that informs the way federal policymakers are approaching issues of housing supply as well. A lot of them will look to the states to see what's being done there in order to kind of inform legislation at the federal level.
So I know you guys just put out the report that's the housing underproduction in the United States. Is that an annual report that you guys produce, or what's the timing on that report?
Yeah, so this is something we've done for the last 4 years. We do it pretty much every year, and it essentially quantifies the amount of housing that has been underproduced in the United States since 2012. So essentially, since the end of the Great Recession all the way through to today. And so what's really key about this report is it really allows us to put a number to the problem. I think we all talk about the issue of not having enough housing. And so it's really important for us to be able to quantify, well, what are we really talking about here? Is it, 5,000 homes? Is it 1 million homes? So this gives us a way to really start to have that conversation about what we should be doing to increase the number of homes.
In regards to that report, a lot of our audience is multifamily owners in Oregon and Washington. How does that region or our region compare to national trends in the housing underproduction
Sure.
through, in that report?
So I'll start with the kind of the national overview. We found in the latest report that housing underproduction in the United States is about 3.85 million homes. Essentially, that's 3.85 million homes that should exist but don't, because the market did not create them. And so this was actually a slight decline from our previous year's findings, where that number was 3.89. I think this reflects some of new supply coming online in different parts of the country, but it's not the same everywhere. So if we're looking at the Pacific Northwest, Washington State still has an underproduction number of 138,000 homes. So essentially, that's the number that has been underproduced in Washington State. In Oregon, it's a little bit lower at 78,000, but still pretty significant.
But again, we have a much lower population than Washington. So I mean,
exactly,
your number,
exactly. Yeah. So if you were to look at this from a population standpoint, it's actually pretty on par with Washington State. And so what's really interesting about these places is that this is a slight decrease in the total number of homes underproduced from the previous year. It's a decrease of about 8,000 in Washington and about 9.7 thousand in Oregon. And we think this reflects a couple of dynamics. The first is that over the last year or so, the new supply has been keeping up with household growth in both of these states by and large. And so we were able to see a bit of a reduction in the number of homes overproduced in both of these states. Another thing to keep in mind is that because of high costs, households are not forming at the rate that they would historically if we had an appropriate number of homes. So this means that in some cases, population may be declining a bit, and so that may be contributing to the decrease in underproduction as well. So not necessarily the way you want to address underproduction, but it is an interesting dynamic that we are seeing in a lot of the West Coast states.
And when you say homes, does that include, multifamily, single family? Is there a division on that, or what does that look like?
Yeah, it's basically any kind of dwelling unit minus second and vacation homes and uninhabitable units. So really anywhere where people live.
I got it. Okay. And then, like you brought up, maybe the change is household formations is slowing down due to economic reasons. So do you have to adjust the research for that?
Yeah, I don't want to say we adjust it, but we definitely make note of it. So, for example, the state that had the biggest drop in underproduction was California, which is a little counterintuitive, knowing
Right.
that California is kind of the epicenter of the housing supply crisis. And what we found when we dug into the data was not that California was building a bunch of new homes, but that a lot of people were actually not forming households; they were leaving the state. And so as a result, they're kind of backing into an improved underproduction number, which is not how you want to actually do this. In contrast, you look at a lot of states in the Sun Belt where they are also, I think, by contrast, building a lot more homes.
Right.
And so they are seeing falling numbers in a number of their metro areas as a result of being able to keep up with household formation. So it's very two different ways in which we are seeing underproduction fall in different metro areas and in different states.
So when you look at, say, Oregon and Washington, what kind of policies do you think have contributed most to the current underproduction? Is it zoning? Is it urban growth boundary, combination thereof? I mean, how do you guys look at that?
Yeah, so it's hard to pinpoint one specific thing, but we know from looking at this topic across the country that it really kind of starts with where you're allowed to build homes, right? So this is your zoning, your land use. You mentioned urban growth boundaries. I think that's probably part of this as well. And then one of the issues we are often seeing coming out of COVID is just the really high cost to build homes, right? Inflation has gone up across the board, and so the cost to build new homes is really high. And we anticipate that in future years, you will actually see the underproduction numbers start to creep up a little bit in a lot of places because housing starts are starting to fall. And so you're not actually seeing new housing coming out of the ground today as much as you were 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, we're seeing that heavily in the Portland, Oregon market. Just a lack of permit activities down. Where I think we had this, I want to say, a bubble with inclusionary zoning at 2017. I want to say an artificial bubble, but a bubble of new construction, and now we're starting to see that trend go the other way. If we get the same numbers of immigration or even stay steady, we're not going to make up for that demand. The question I have for you guys, and I know when we started Up for Growth, or you guys started a long time ago, there was kind of in using to give hard data, because we can all say anecdotally there's not enough housing, but what does that data look like? What kind of reception do you get from the governmental response in looking at that? Are they starting to realize we can talk about it, but it's it's maybe easier to make the argument when you've got firm numbers of 78,000 and 138,000 by state of underproduction in housing?
Yeah, so it's incredibly useful for policymakers to be able to point to a specific number as both a way to kind of assess how severe the challenge is, but also as a way to understand where the challenges are specifically. And so when we have conversations with lawmakers, they really like to have these numbers in front of them. They also help supplement the on-the-ground stories they're hearing from constituents, right? So a lot of them know just from hearing from the people they represent that there is an issue with housing, but having some data behind that allows them to really talk about this more globally and in context and in comparison to other areas too, right? So you can say my region is lagging behind some of these other regions that are actually doing a little bit better.
Right.
So it can also oftentimes spark a bit of a competition as well. You don't want to be behind some of your peer cities or peer regions, and so that's a good way for lawmakers to compare across places.
And when you look at, if that was the government side, on the community feedback, what kind of, in your discussions about lack of housing or lack of housing production, what kind of feedback do you get in those situations? Or is this report out so new you haven't, maybe in previous years, what kind of feedback did you get?
I think the feedback we get when we talk to stakeholder organizations or community groups is really that it kind of squares with what they are seeing on the ground. So in a lot of places, we are seeing significant kind of visual impacts of a lack of housing supply, whether that's unsheltered homeless individuals or people who are doubling up who would not otherwise, or people who can't afford to get into a starter home. These numbers kind of validate those experiences. They're not just one-off things. It really tells the story from a different perspective from what they are actually seeing in real life. So it kind of attacks the issue from both angles in terms of putting the issue in the right context.
And everybody likes stories, and are there success stories where you can look at a municipality or a state or a city and say, look how there was an underproduction issue there. Look how they addressed it with policy or a variety of issues. I mean, is there a couple that you point to as examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually profile 2 specific metro areas in the report that have done a good job of addressing their underproduction through increased supply and regulatory reform. Those are Salt Lake City and the Raleigh area in North Carolina. We identified some of the policies that have been in place for years, really, right? This didn't just happen overnight. They were very proactive in creating the regulatory framework to support a lot of new housing and a lot of small scale housing too. This is really interesting in Raleigh as well. So they have been really proactive in legalizing kind of missing middle housing. So things like duplexes and triplexes. They're a bit ahead of the curve from a lot of other cities, and you're already starting to see a lot of uptake as a result of those policy changes. And so we pointed to those specific regions. There are certainly others as well, but we highlighted them to show that a lot of places are building enough as a result of some of the changes they have been able to make on the regulatory side.
And David, what do you attribute that to? The political will, or what's why Salt Lake and Raleigh versus say Seattle or Denver? I mean, what are some of the initial drivers, or is it such a complex issue it's really hard to see one or two drivers that kind of get that ball rolling?
That's a really good question. I think it's a little bit different in both places. We observed in the Salt Lake City region that this growth was kind of intentionally planned for in long-range planning documents. And so they have, for a long time, been really committed to growing around transit nodes, doing infill development. And so they kind of were ahead of the curve in a lot of places. And then in Raleigh, it really was kind of a reaction to what they were seeing on the ground in terms of what was happening on the housing market there. You're hearing a lot from people who are struggling, and so they very quickly reacted and made that decision. And I shouldn't say very quickly, but they're a lot more nimble than a lot of other cities that we see here. I think a lot of this is the set of fortunate circumstances where you have policymakers who really understand the issue and understand what it takes to address it. I think a lot of times we are playing kind of defense or catch up in terms of, what kind of zoning changes or reforms we need to make in order to fix this challenge. And you don't always have policymakers who understand the real technical issues that go into solving the housing problem. And so I think in these places you happen to have people who really did get it. That's not to say that lawmakers in Oregon or Washington don't get it. I think there are a lot of folks there who do. I think it's just these places, for whatever reason, were a bit ahead of the curve than some of their peer regions. And again, you are starting to see the numbers in Washington and Oregon turn in the right direction as a result of new supply coming online. So that's very good news. The one bit of caution I will give is something I mentioned earlier is, we are likely to see a slowdown because now permits are not keeping up. And so while we have seen a little bit of gain this year and perhaps next year, I think we are really concerned about the combination of high prices and interest rates still remaining pretty high is going to keep a lot of projects in the ground for a couple more years, and then we're going to have to play catch up again.
So as policy director, how do you, that's one thing we've noticed, especially with elected officials, when you're talking about housing production and things like that, these are long, this doesn't happen overnight. It's what you put in place just to go from vacant land up to construction. It could be anywhere from, here especially 2 to 3 years. Trying to have them have that forward lookout that their thing to keep it going. How is that? Is the response to that? Sometimes I feel like there's decisions made on the elected side that, hey, that's going to sound good, it's going to look good, but we know it's not going to get the desired results. Something like in the way they did inclusionary zoning here. It's just now they're looking back saying it didn't get what we wanted to go.
Yeah, I think what you bring up is a really good.
So how do you get people to jump on that?
Yeah, so I think what you mentioned is a really big challenge, right? Because good housing policy doesn't always yield the results you want immediately, and so policymakers really want to be able to show their constituents immediate that they're addressing an issue immediately, and that their constituents can expect to see relief in the short term. But as you know, it takes years, even under the best conditions, to build new housing from start to finish. And so a lot of times it takes a lot of political courage and understanding from those policymakers to say, this is what we need to do to fix the structural issue of a lack of housing, even though I know that it's still going to take a bit of time for those new homes to be created as a result of these policy changes. But using the report to have this conversation is really key, because it shows you how much over the years the underproduction number has been increasing. And so without any action, you're really not going to see any improvement there. So while it has taken years, if not decades, to get to this point in a lot of places, we really need to start making some of those hard policy decisions today. Otherwise, in 5 to 10 years, this situation is going to be even worse than we see today.
And with a lot of zoning and things like that being at the local level, the state level, you guys doing a lot of stuff in Washington, is it kind of having maybe more of a push on the federal side, or to kind of get this kind of top down, I guess would be one way to look at it, to try to drive this? Is if I think we've seen, if we leave it to the local municipalities, they're very slow to change, and there's some will, some not, and it exasperates the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a very specific role the federal government can be playing to incentivize more localities or states to undertake these pro-housing reforms. Some of it's already in place. Just last year, the administration announced $85 million, which is, in the grand scheme of things, pretty small, but pretty significant that they found that this issue was important enough to dedicate federal funds to incentivize cities to undergo zoning reforms or other reforms that would lead to more housing in the long run. So there's a recognition there. We also see several pieces of legislation that have been introduced that also try to push cities to do more pro-housing work, cities and states, I should say. And so we are kind of active in those conversations and having conversations with lawmakers to get them to understand that while zoning and land use is inherently really a local and by extension a state issue, the federal government can be really helpful to get cities to do this kind of work in collaboration with the federal government, or with resources from the federal government too.
Right. And for Up for Growth, I mean, what other research are you guys looking at in the future to, foster this idea where people? I mean, it's, I guess they point to Salt Lake and Raleigh as two places that have had growth and employment growth. And as we've always said, if you don't have affordable housing, it's going to be hard to get employment growth. But I mean, what other kind of research are you guys looking at to kind of guide some of the policy?
Yeah, so a lot of it is doing deeper dives into these places and understanding, okay, what were the dynamics that led to the policymakers doing what we characterize as being really pro-housing. And so that's a really big piece of it too. And then, we've talked today about, a lot of zoning reforms or land use changes, I think is kind of, the foundation of creating more housing in the long run. We also work a lot on understanding what are the other barriers, particularly on the federal side, right? So what policies are in place that increase the cost of housing overall, and how can we address that? Are there changes that can be made to existing federal financing programs that can help developers access capital in a down market to help keep the supply moving forward? So we try to look at all of these things, right? It's not just the zoning and the land use issue. You can change the zoning all you want. You can change your setbacks, your height limits, but unless the right economic conditions exist, the housing just won't get built. And so we also think a lot about what are the other things that we can be examining that are in the purview of the federal government that can be changed to address some of these more structural economic market issues.
Yeah, that's what we've said. I mean, it's just not zoning and things like that. You've got to have policies in place. Or capital's got to come and want to invest to create that housing. Because if you just rely on the local, there's just not enough horsepower, especially in these markets, to keep up with the underproduction.
As a result of these zoning and land use changes, we're seeing a lot of conversation about the need to build this smaller scale housing, duplexes, smaller apartment buildings, things that we used to build 50, 60 years ago that in many places are not legal now. As cities adjust their zoning to allow for these things once again, we also think about, where is the ecosystem of developers who are going to build this stuff. Like a lot of the larger multifamily or single-family builders are probably not going to do infill developments on empty lots here and there. And so we really have to think about fostering a new ecosystem of development for people to take advantage of those zoning changes. So making sure they have access to capital, making sure that there are not rules that are unintentionally hindering smaller scale development versus larger scale like multifamily development. And so these are the things that I think we need to consider in addition to regulatory changes.
Exactly. Okay. Well, Dave, I want to commend you guys for the work you've done, because it's a hard there's a lot of complex parts on housing, and people can focus on one or other, but like you said, you've got to make a deep dive to really look at why one market's producing and other not. So I think being able to do that and quantify some numbers helps make that argument a lot easier with elected officials and just community members and stakeholders. So I applaud you guys for doing that. And if people want to learn more about that report, they've got the link down below, and to see the report and want to know more for Up for Growth, please go to their website and check it out. And Dave, thanks for taking the time to do this, and I'm sure we'll do it again.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.